Welcome to the Sports Entrepreneurs Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Luer, and today we're crossing over back to the United States to Baltimore, Maryland to catch up with Alexander Brown, or better known as Sandy Brown. Welcome to the podcast, Sandy.
Thank you, Marcus. Great to be here.
Yeah, looking forward to our conversation here. And, you have a very long CV with amazing stops across the board, starting, of course, or a lot of people might know you from your days with ESPN here in Asia. Then, of course, many stops in the United States, One World Sports, and obviously currently sort of in the final rounds with Major League Lacrosse there. So we'll touch on all those things, the stops, clearly lots of it linked to the world of television, broadcasting, and we're going to do a deep dive into that world. And then all the other, fun things you kind of did in your career. So I'm sure we'll have plenty of fun reminiscing around, especially, of course, you were here at the same time I was here in Asia, and I've been still in Asia, of course. So I'm sure we have some fun stories to compare here. But as we always do, we'll kind of start right where it started. And I guess you came out of university there in Washington in the mid-'80s. And you ended up working with ProServ, I believe, at the very beginning. Tell us a bit, how do you got in there, and how do you manage to, hang out with Donald and David?
Well, it was quite an introduction into the world of sports television. It was not only serendipitous, but certainly by happenstance. I grew up playing a lot of tennis as a junior. Actually played with Pam Shriver a bit in Interclub. And my junior and senior year in university, ran a tennis club at the beach in Delaware. And one of the owners of the club was Frank DeFord. And Frank was probably one of the greatest sports writers ever here in the United States. Okay. And he was at Sports Illustrated for many years. And he is a native Baltimorean, and I went to see him before my senior year in college and said, I want to be in the sports business, and what do you suggest? And so he put me in touch with a gal named Sarah Kleppinger, now Sarah Fornashari, who again is another Baltimorean, who was an attorney at ProServ. Mm-hmm. And so I went and met with Sarah, and we hit it off and told her what I wanted to do. And so I became her project. And so she organized an internship for me at Christmas at ProServ, for which I ended up working for Joe Steranka, who at that time handled all the PR for ProServ. So I interned with Joe for a month. And of course, while I was there, they said to me, you don't want to be managing tennis players, you want to be in television. And I said, yes, I want to be in television. So that's sort of how it all started. And then I met Herb Swan, God rest his soul, interned. I did my internship. Then I had, have 7 different interviews that spring. And I was also playing Division I lacrosse at that time. And they wanted to hire somebody that didn't want to pay very much to go run around the world and sell broadcast rights for the properties that they represented at that time and owned. And the principal rights that they had were the MIPTC Tour, which is a predecessor to the ATP and the NBA. And then some other pro products. Anyway, so I was fortunate enough to get the job, and Herb called me one day. He said, "Well, Donald wants to offer you the job personally. So can you come up here and we can take care of that?" And so I drove up from school. I went to school in Virginia, and met Donald. It happened to be Memorial Day weekend, which is a big bank holiday weekend, and in Washington, and he was headed to Carling Bassett's wedding. Carling Bassett was a ProServ client, and she was marrying Robert Seguso, who was another ProServ client that weekend. And so we drove out to National Airport in his Chrysler LeBaron limousine. I didn't even know that Chrysler LeBaron made a limousine, but obviously Donald found one. So anyway, so we drove out there, and Donald offered me the job, and of course I said yes and what have you. And we get to National. It's an absolute zoo at the airport. And Donald looks at me and and says, Sandy, I need you to do me a favor. Wally, who's his driver, is going to get his bags. I need you to drive the limousine around National until Wally comes out from taking my bags in. And so I got in the limousine and drove the limousine around National Airport, which is the equivalent of driving around the Arc de Triomphe in Paris at rush hour. And that was my introduction to ProServ.
I like it. Nice one.
So then, I was able to get through that part of things unscathed. I graduated from college on Friday and started work on Monday.
I got it. So how many years were you with ProServ then?
I was there a little over 2 years, and I worked for Herb and for Dennis Spencer.
Oh, goodness.
And I literally was there about 2 weeks, and they gave me a plane ticket and said, go to Europe and sell tennis.
Right. I love it.
Aside from the fact that when I met Dennis the first time was in that 2 week span, and he was down in Dallas, and I walked in his office and we chit-chatted. Dennis has always been a man of few words.
Dennis is actually one of the nicest guys I can think of in our industry. He is, right?
He really is.
Yeah,
he really is.
Absolutely.
One thing I'll never forget is I walked out of his office and he pointed me to the conference table and he said, you see that stack of varieties, which I'm telling you was probably 2 feet? He said, go learn the television business. So that was part of my education.
Okay.
But I mean, I the interesting thing about it was it was a global job. I mean, I obviously got my introduction to the NBA and obviously spent a lot of time on the tennis business. ProServ at the time, I mean, we had in the management side of the house with all of the NBA players that we had, which at that time were, Michael Jordan and James Worthy, Patrick Ewing. We had 4 out of the 5 of the top 5 in the ATP, Payne Stewart, Boomer Esiason. And so we had a really robust management business. We owned a bunch of tennis tournaments. We had our relationship with the NBA and the ATP or the MIPTC tour.
ProServ was hot stuff in those times, right? I mean, it was really IMG and them who were sort of competing right at the highest level there.
It was IMG, Advantage, which, as you know, was part of ProServ until 1980, and then obviously us. But I also got a chance to spend a lot of time with Peter Smith, another titian in our business, and again, God rest his soul. And I've dealt with Peter for years after that. But obviously, those relationships were forged at that time, and obviously with many others. But it was a very interesting time to be there. There's no question about it. And the other thing I was thinking was that there was no Sportel,
right?
So we all went to
Not
MIP
yet.
and MIP, and the likes of Umberto Gandini and Mark Riley and Bill Ord and Laura Cottrell and George Black and Carl Bassani and Andrea Bassani. I mean, we'd all get together at MIP and MIPCOM, and that's where it all started. The idea of having our own show. Yep. But it was, those were very interesting times, and the television business was really changing from many networks internationally that were state-owned were finally becoming more commercial, and that was even before satellite became prevalent.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're really there in the early days. Now, so in the 90s, then I guess 1990 is you made the switch for a couple of years to the NBA. Assuming that came out of the relationship, like you said, which ProServ had with the NBA, or how did that sort of come about?
Yeah, I mean, I left ProServ to go work for Drexel Burnham because I was really trying to figure out whether I wanted to be in the sports business for the rest of my life, and I went to Drexel, which was obviously a very interesting time to be there. And in the late 80s, they started to go down the chutes. And then the NBA decided they wanted to basically bring all their rights in-house. And I was working directly with Ed Desser at the NBA when I was at ProServ. And so he called me and said, would you be interested in doing this? And I said, absolutely. And that was again, very, very fortuitous. So my role there was to oversee all the league's international television interests. And, I guess a better byproduct of that was developing my relationship with David Stern. Mm-hmm. And, I have to say that it was, he, like there are many people, many of us that have had this experience with him. But I mean, he was a big mentor of mine, professionally and personally, and I loved him. He was a great individual, and I have to say that I guess I was there again probably, I don't know, 2 weeks, and MIP was upon us, and I was about to leave to go to MIP that night, and so he asked me to come to his office that afternoon, and I sat with him literally for 2 hours, just the two of us in his office. And he basically, preached the world according to David Stern.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And was laid out all of his expectations and so forth. But I mean, those are 2 hours of my life that I will never forget. Mm-hmm. And it was absolutely fabulous.
Amazing. How old were you at the time? I mean, you obviously you must still be quite young at that time, right?
Yeah, but I was 20, 26.
Right. Yeah, well, amazing.
And
actually, today that later we'll be releasing the podcast with Scott Levy, who obviously is spent more than 2 decades with the NBA, and I think came a little bit after you there, sort of to take on the role of international NBA business, TV business as well. And he's talking similarly about, of course, how the business for international television was one of sort of David Stern's sort of pet project, right? He really wanted to push this, and he saw the huge opportunities. So when you were working there for those couple of years, what was it, which territory were you guys already going after? Was it China already on the radar, or what was sort of your remit?
Well, my remit was everything. I mean,
Okay.
I ran the whole thing. And I mean, I can remember going back to my days at ProServ when the NBA occupied one corner of one floor on an Olympic Tower. And now it's obviously grown like a weed, but I mean, we were there really at the outset. And he had, I guess, when I joined ProServ, he'd only been commissioner for a year. But you're right, it was obviously a very important priority for him. And but we really try to circumnavigate the globe in terms of trying to get as many deals as we possibly could get done. And obviously we were able to create a series of packages that were customized for different parts of the world. And so my relationships that I had developed at ProServ served me well in terms of being able to get things done with the NBA. And obviously China, as you correctly point out, was a big priority. And I did visit CCT with David. And of course we were over there for the launch of we were opening our season in Tokyo. And so he and I went to CCTV.
Okay.
And lined this meeting up with a guy named Li Chuang, who was an international guy at CCTV. And of course we get to the guardhouse and they have no record of the.
I've had that before. Yes.
You can only imagine where my heart was at that particular time. And Stern looked over at me, and I'll never forget that look. And he loved to rib me about that till the day he died. But anyway, they the guy did find the meeting on the schedule, whatever. We went in and we did our thing. But it was, it was a very interesting. It was a very interesting experience for me.
That is really, really the early days there. I love it. Now,
and I will also tell you that look, there are a couple of things that I think are really important when you think about David, and I mean, the foundational principles that he had in terms of how you handle staff and how you look at various situations they've stuck with me my entire career. And I think he had an unrelenting work ethic, and he expected nothing less of any of us, and more to the point, he was really all about execution.
Right.
But his mantra to us was basically he's going to give us all the tools that we needed to do our job, whether it's research or conferences or whatever. But he expected that we were going to know more about our business than anybody else. Mm. And I had one situation. I was sitting in my office, and David walks by my office, and he pokes his head in, and he goes, "Brown, how many television households are there in Uzbekistan?"
Right.
And I had to have the answer, and I did. And I can tell you, just sort of a segue to something else. I mean, the number of meetings that I was in with him and there are many others that can share this, where someone gave them an answer to a question that was not well thought out, and they got crucified.
Right.
And I said to myself, I am never going to be that person. I never was.
Right.
But he always asked the question that you didn't have the answer to, and which, to the point I made earlier, it was incumbent upon us to basically read and know our business better than anybody else, and that was something
that for sure came across in Scott's when I was talking to him about as well. So yeah, that seems to be. I've never met David, unfortunately, but sounds like some amazing learning there. Now, again, the obvious question then is, so you've had a good start here, right? ProServ, NBA, that looks good on everyone's CV. But how on earth do you get to Asia and become eventually the managing director for ESPN Star Sports, or ESPN Asia first before it became obviously Star Sports? How do you make that jump? Talk us through that.
Well, obviously our circles are not big, so we travel, and when we go to these conferences, and we travel in packs. And the other thing is ESPN was a client of ours, and Andy Bryant was building the ESPN business, the international business at the time. So I had a lot of interaction with those guys. And as part of their expansion strategy, they're looking at Asia. Right. Interesting enough, I had been offered a job when I was at ProServ to go to Hong Kong with IMG, which I didn't do. But I'd always had a fascination about Asia, and it was a big step up. I mean, I was 28 at the time, and they wanted me to send me out there to basically plant the flag and launch the business. And I remember when I went in to see, this is just sort of another Stern story, but I went in to see David and tell him about this. And he asked me how much they were going to pay me. And I told him. And so next thing you know, when I finally got my offer, it was higher than what I was originally told it was going to be. And I know he went to bat and basically called Bornstein and said, "You're not paying this guy enough money." So,
oh wow. Okay.
So he was always trying to do my bidding for me, but it was a great opportunity, and I will always be grateful to Herb Granath and Steve and Andy Bryant for basically having the confidence in me to do this. The one thing I will just say about the NBA, just to finish this up, is I liken it to a little bit like Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. Right. And I think Adam has done a really good job of preserving that legacy at the NBA, and you always are family there. And it was just a great, even though I wasn't there very long, it was a great experience. Right. So anyway,
going to this was ESPN Asia when you went first there. You went to Hong Kong, was it? That was their setup, or where they were based?
So I went out there with. I started, I guess, in February, and I literally the 2 days after I started, Andy Bryant and I went to Hong Kong to this AIC conference, which was literally the start of the cable. It was the birth of the cable industry in Asia.
Right.
Everybody and their brother was there. Ted Turner was there. John Malone was there. I don't think Rupert was there, but it was a who's who from every international executive at every U.S. network. They were all there, and that coincided with the launch of an Indonesian satellite called Palapa, which at that time the only bird over Asia was an Intelsat bird, which necessitated 12-meter dishes. And what Palapa was able to do was it was to allow for 4-meter dishes, so you could basically have a backyard dish, and then you'd be able to create your own cable system, and that's right. It really was a cottage industry at that time. Yep. And the other thing that happened was that there was a banker in Indonesia named Peter Gunther who was close to the Suharto family, who wanted to take advantage of all the dishes in Indonesia that were looking at Palapa, right. Which is the satellite set right over Indonesia. And he wanted to launch a DTH business, and he wanted a bunch of the U.S. networks, and that was us, HBO, CNN, and Discovery, and then we added in TVB. So that was the Gang of Five. Mm-hmm. Now, that was, unfortunately, it didn't pan out the way that everyone thought it was, but it was but that's what got us all out there.
Right. Okay. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I arrived in Asia later part of '94, so this is a couple of years before. We're in '92 here, which, as you said, that was truly the birthday of TV. I guess satellite and TV in Asia in that sense. Now let's have a look at. Okay, so you guys are launching a channel. There's a whole bunch of logistics on that, and maybe we won't go into that. But let's talk a bit about content. What is it? What you guys first brought into Asia? What was the ESPN? What was ESPN Asia at that time about?
Well, we obviously had a lot of international content, not necessarily content for Asia, but we had content which was live. So we carried the NBA, and obviously we carried baseball, and we carried the NFL, and we had IndyCar and so forth. And the other thing we had was the Premier League. We had the Monday night games of the Premier League.
Oh, right. Okay.
Which I have to say that the Premier League was a significant driver of value for us out there, even if we only had one match. But ultimately, as we went down the road and created ESS, a number of the local cable operators went and did deals with the EPL directly because they knew that was going to drive.
That was a huge driver. And well, we'll talk a bit more about it. Definitely when we get to ESS. Now, two questions come to mind. Number one is, do you still know the number, what you guys were paying for that one match for Premier League, just in comparison where it obviously is now?
No, I don't remember what the number was.
Okay, no problem. Now, in terms of the footprint, right? As you said, there wasn't really a satellite structure yet fully in place. So, what was it? What were you really covering? What was Asia for you at that time?
So, Asia was everything except South Asia at that point, and so we had pre-existing joint ventures in Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and then we had our presence in Southeast Asia. So obviously the two, Southeast Asia and Greater China, with the exception of China, which I'll get to that in a second. But we could cover the Pacific with Intelsat. We had space on the Intelsat bird, and then we obviously had a transponder on Palapa. In order for us to get to India, and by the way, we could also get to India and to the rest of China through Pan Amsat. So we took space on Pan Amsat,
but you only had one channel, right? It's just one dedicated feed, right? It's not you had multiple feeds already.
At that point, we had one trunk feed that basically did everything else. Now, we were on the Intelsat bird. We had our trunk feed, and then on Palapa, we were able to do some level of customization on that. So we were able to get all of those at that point, and everything was coming out of Bristol.
Right, got it. Interesting. Yeah. Now, let's talk a bit about. Well, we'll touch on India maybe later. China, as you mentioned, of course, always had this wall garden, and basically no one really got it. Not many people really got in there, include even sports, as maybe unpolitical as it even is. Right? But it was, it was always an area which was just shut down for just about everyone. So I guess that you guys had the same issue there, or what sort of structures you were able to do in China?
Well, it's actually very interesting. So when I went out there, I was me, myself, and I in a business center in Admiralty in Hong Kong. And I started off in the Admiralty Business Center, and then I started to hire a few people, and we moved over to Hong Kong Telecom, where ABC had a relationship, and we had basically a big conference room there. And then we moved to Citicorp Center in Causeway Bay, and that was our office in Hong Kong, and we were able to populate that pretty well. One key hire that I made was a guy named Simon Yu from TVB, who worked for SK Fung, and Simon almost single-handedly navigated the whole China business for us. And not only did he have great relationships, but he was very creative in getting deals done. And we were so successful that we were able to get deals done in basically every province with the exception of two.
Right, okay.
And there are some facets to this that were very interesting. I mean, certainly we did not suffer the same issues that some of the news networks did, like CNN. And by the way, we were all of us only supposed to be in hotels.
Right. Yeah, that's what I thought.
But we're sports, and every cable operator wanted us.
Right.
And we didn't really. I mean, we'll talk about this later in terms of the ARPU, but we were able to get paid. But the deal structure was very interesting because at that point, every cable operator is, without question, in terms of every deal that we did, every cable operator incorporated into the deal a trip out of China. They all wanted to travel.
Right. Okay.
So we had to facilitate a trip for every cable, the head of for probably 2 people at every one of these cable stations.
Yeah, well, and you got a lot of stations in China, a lot of provinces.
We would take them to MIP. We took them to Las Vegas. I mean, I'll never forget. We took them to Vegas, and we gave each of them $100 to go do what they wanted to do. I mean, they thought they were in heaven.
It took them to nappy, basically, is it?
But Simon organized all this, and I give Herb and Steve a lot of credit for giving us, and Andy obviously, for giving us the latitude to do all this stuff. But this is the kind of creativity that we needed to have to be able to get these deals done, and it allowed us to be able to get carriage in all these systems. Right. And the other thing is Simon did a great job of working with SARFT. Madame Chaiwa was the gal at SARFT who was our liaison, and she was very supportive of what we did. And we had one situation, I'll say this, where I think we got taken down for 24 hours because there was a scene in Domestic Sports Center, which was probably 5 seconds of the tanks in Tiananmen Square.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Somebody in the ministry saw it. So we got slapped on the wrist like everyone else did. But that was the only time that we got taken down. But it was the other thing that was interesting at that time was that we had not yet been acquired by Disney. And they were trying to do everything they could to get carriage, and it annoyed them no end that we were able to get carriage in as many places as we were, and they weren't. Right. And so ultimately, they tried to get us taken off at one point, but soon thereafter we ended up merging with them, or they bought us, I should say, and then we're all on the same team. So very interesting.
So let's jump a bit up a couple of years into the future here. So we're in the mid 90s now, and again by that time already in Asia too, and I do remember this, quite well. There was huge rivalry, of course, between ESPN's Asia and then what was called Star Sports Asia, or Star Sports. Which is Murdoch, and that side of the family there. We all like that. We were already in the TV business at that time as well. We were already selling TV rights, WWE, and a few other things. So it was good for us. And then you guys decided, let's merge this thing because, maybe it made some sense at a top level. Talk us through that, because obviously you were right in the middle of it. You obviously become the managing director then of the merging entity for the next several years. Just explain that a bit. How to get 2 big giants, which are on paper fierce rivals, probably in many parts of the world, deciding, okay, let's go do this together.
Well, let me just take a step back before I do that. I mean, we as I mentioned earlier, we were sending everything out of Bristol, which our good friend Bernard Stewart had a lot to do. And so we cut a deal with the Singaporean government to build a facility in Singapore, which also allowed us to be able to get uplinking out of there because Hong Kong Telecom was making it absolutely prohibitive for us to do that. Right. So we basically created our own facility, and that allowed us to be really customized for the region. Mm-hmm. In 1993, Rupert Murdoch purchased Star, and by 94, things were really moving down the track in terms of their business, which really was a function of having 2 free-to-air feeds, one over China and one over India. And that didn't do any of us that were trying to sell product any good because they're free and we were not. And Herb Granath was actually on a plane to go to London and ended up seeing Rupert on the plane, and they sat together and started talking about things and basically agreed that the competition in Asia was not doing anybody any good and that we should think about a merger. and so that's how it all started.
Okay.
And there's a lot of work that went into it. We called it Project Yalta. It was the code name.
Okay.
This is a great story. We, as part and parcel of all this, we had agreed that we were not, with Star and ESPN agreed we were not going to be acquiring any content other than what we had currently. And before this conversation with Star began, we had gone well down the track with CSI about acquiring or renewing a very sizable cricket package, which covered probably 5 different boards. Mm-hmm. And Dave Zucker and I, who I work very closely with, were in Australia. I guess it was probably September or October of '96, and we were down there for the Australian. India was playing Australia, and so we were there to also meet Jim Fitzmaurice from CSI to close the deal. And so we're sitting in the Regent in Sydney having this conversation, and Zucker looked at him and said, "Well, we're not going to bid. We decided we're not going to bid." And he went absolutely ballistic. And I had no idea any of this. I thought we'd agreed we were going to put our offer on the table, and then David pulls that one out. And Fitzmaurice, the reason he went nuts was because of the fact that he had already knew that Gary Davey wasn't going to bid on the Star side. Mm. So he was just left there hanging in the wind. It was absolutely classic. So we walked out of the meeting, and I looked at Zucker. I said, "Can you just tell me what that was all about?" He said, "Well, let's talk about it over dinner." So he and I went to dinner, and then he filled me in on all the things that were going on with the merger. And the reason that he couldn't tell me is because I knew nothing of what was going on, is because they wanted me to run it. Mm-hmm. So that's when he said, "Look, this is what's going on. We want you to run the thing." And so after that, then all the management teams got together, and we sat down and started taking the thing apart and trying to put everyone together. And it was quite an exercise. And I have to say, I mean, the amount of financial rigor that went into this thing was really amazing. I mean, we did our 5-year plan, we did our budgets. I mean, I was used to all the stuff through ESPN. I don't think the Star guys were as used to it. But Bruce Churchill came in from News Corp to basically take over all the stuff at Star in terms of sort of in his COO role, and he and David basically ran the joint venture at the shareholder level, and they were awesome. And I loved working for those guys. For all of the fact that you've got 2 strange bedfellows that have come together to create this thing, and with cultures and philosophies that are diametrically opposed, I have to say, out of all the joint ventures that I have been associated with, it was one that worked the best. Because everyone was completely focused on making this thing work. And I, of course, as you mentioned earlier, had the task of being the first managing director. And it was not only putting these 2 organizations together, but it was taking a business that on a combined basis, it was losing $125 million and trying to get that to break even.
Right. And I think last time you mentioned you managed to do that. How many years did it take to get there?
Yeah, we did it over 4 years,
right, okay.
Just about 4 years. And I mean, look, the Star people were absolutely. I mean, look, Rick Dovey he was my successor, is a very good friend of mine. I mean, right. It was just we took the best of the best and put everybody together, and everyone just sort of got on with it. It really was. I mean, I was funny yesterday. I was looking back at some photos that I have of all of our exploits over the years and the things that we've done, and it was incredible. And sorry that those businesses are no longer still in existence, but it was certainly probably the most provocative media merger of its time, and it was great to be a part of it.
Yeah, and let's talk a bit about it for a minute. But before we get there, this whole baby was called ESPN Star Sports, or ESS as we all called it in Asia. So again, before we get into, we jump up way ahead, of course, because it was just, obviously, a year or 2 ago when it was all shut down. Let's talk a bit about at that time. Now you have two footprints, two groups. You have different channels. You guys doing you're doing a bunch of rebranding because obviously the channels end up having similar names. Just talk a bit about that. How did that work? And what as you said, what eventually did it do the bottom line? Not just it took competition out, but I guess you had a broader portfolio, and on the back of it, I guess you are the dominant player in Asia at that moment in time. At that time, I think the local let's say the Astros of the world or Singapore Telco, they weren't really competing yet in that sense, right? They were just customers in most cases. So just talk about that.
It was interesting. I mean, obviously, both from the distribution and the acquisition side, from the acquisition piece. I mean, I can tell you going to Sportel, and I'm sure when this deal was announced, the Bill Sindrichs of the world and the Mark Mascarenas, their faces just
most of us did drop.
Yeah, I mean,
exactly.
But and then of course we obviously had to be careful. We couldn't go in and basically say, okay, fine, your rate's now $5 a month. All that kind of thing went to any of our distributors. But we obviously did what we had to do to be able to. I mean, we had a lot of rights we didn't need. We cut a lot of cost out of the business. There's a big catalyst out of all this called India, which I'll just touch on in a second. We had, obviously, our feeds were pay and Stars were not. And we knew we weren't going to be able to get carriage for Star in China in any way, shape, or form, because obviously the comment that Rupert had made, back in the
actually, I remember,
got help hot water with the Chinese, and we just knew that we were not going to get carriage for Star Sports. However, in terms of India, we knew the only way to make it work was that we had to be able to flip the switch. Now, we had already launched our business in India with the Modis, and this is actually a very interesting story. We got in bed with the Modis. At that time, there were probably 50,000 cable operators in India, and we knew we needed a partner on the ground to help us get our business launched. Mm-hmm. We went and we bought the rights to the BCCI exclusively, right, which obviously, as you know, went Indian cricket. And we ended up cutting a deal with them so that Doordarshan had a piece of it. I'll also tell you that News Corp, unbeknownst to us, happened to put Roddy Basu, who was the head of Doordarshan, on their board, and I had to go see Basu twice, as part of this exercise to cut a deal with them, and he made me sit outside of his office for 8 hours. So when the first ESS board meeting and Basu's on the other side of the table, it's everything I could do to keep the ESPN guys from reaching across the table to wring his neck. But the one thing that was very helpful to us in terms of the Modis were that they also had the Philip Morris distributorship in India. Mm-hmm. So they had guys riding around on bicycles selling sticks of cigarettes. Right. And these are the guys that we use to collect money from the cable operators.
Right. Cable operators in India is a whole nother level. I mean, we can spend a whole podcast on this.
Yeah. I mean, but there's no way we ever would have been able to launch our business. I mean, look, you could have taken any of the other industrial houses as Tata or Reliance or whatever, but, the Modis, they had this infrastructure that and the will to do it. And, for, a period of time, it worked out perfectly.
Right. I got to throw a funny story in here. We took a couple of WWE wrestlers, including Big Show, which is the biggest guy WWE had at that time, as in size-wise, right? We took him on a cable operator tour across India, and you can't believe, what I'm talking about, right? This cable is not a cable operator as in when you think of it from the United States, which has a nice building somewhere on a proper street, right? This is a house somewhere in the middle of nowhere with 1,000 cables coming off the roof, going across the entire neighborhood, connecting 2 million people, right? That was the kind of cable operators we were visiting there, which the local partner there, our 10 Sports or Touch TV at that time, Chris McDonald, I'm sure you know him too. took us though, and it was unbelievable. I mean, all of us, we just fell off our chairs when we arrived at these places. So, I'm just trying to get people to visualize when we say cable operators. If you're in the Western world, you probably think of a nice, big, fancy office. That's not really what India cable operators are. Right?
No,
I'm sure.
no. And listen, Chris was my right hand for the good bit of the time that I was there, and we spent a lot of time in India.
Of course.
I mean, I'm in Bombay, and you go to an apartment building, and to your point, it's like it's just a big. You think you're in the middle of a big ball of spaghetti with all these wires going all over the place. I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah.
So interestingly enough, we flipped the switch for Star with the cricket match that happened to be in India, and we also had a situation at the same time where I think we had incorporated a rate hike for ESPN for whatever reason. Well, Manu Sahni, who ran our business at the time there, they were in Bombay, and they were surrounded by the Shiv Sena, which is a big political party in Maharashtra, also owned a bunch of cable systems. And so these guys basically surrounded our office with jeeps with machine guns and started shooting them off to try to scare our guys. And with this rate hike, and I'm on the phone with Manu. These guys are huddled in the office, and I can hear all the stuff going on. It was unbelievable. But that's the Wild West. I mean, that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Try to get business launched.
Yeah. No. I mean, look, I had 3 offices in India, a fairly large team there for many years, and I loved the trips there, but there were something always went wrong, and it was, you managed chaos constantly, that's for sure. And I've no doubt, obviously, Star TV or Star Sports is still very successful in India, and it's, I'm sure it was always a bit of the crown jewel. Let's talk a bit about the numbers here. Getting from $125 million losses to break even, that obviously means not just shrinking costs, but obviously generating more revenue. What was probably the most profitable part of the business if you segment it down into regions or particular countries?
Well, I mean, this also goes to sort of the whole ARPU discussion. I mean, and I think there are lessons to be learned as we think about sort of what's happening currently with a lot of these streaming businesses, whether it's Disney or Netflix or whatever. I mean, it really is all about it's the blend. So, we were getting $1 a sub at that time, which wasn't too far off what was being garnered in the States for Southeast Asia, for the more mature market, shall we say. Also, you have to look at that against retail rate. What's your retail rate? What can they stomach?
Correct.
And the other issue, of course, we had to deal with is, had the likes of HBO, which, I mean, we were very, we could provide volume discounts and all that kind of stuff. HBO wasn't doing any of that, and that was always a big bone of contention with us, all of us, with the movie channels in terms of and I understand they needed to have a bigger number, but when we think about China, it was a penny a sub, and when you think about India, it was 5 cents a sub. We used to say it's less than the price of a thumbs up, which is sort of the equivalent of Coke in India. So, I mean, obviously,
that's a huge difference, right?
It's a numbers game, but you're dealing with a lot of variables in terms of pricing in each one of these markets. So, I mean, look, at the end of the day, the biggest ARPU came out of Southeast Asia and Greater China, ex-China, which means Taiwan. And you also had a situation where these cable subs were increasing rapidly because those businesses, I said earlier, it was a cottage industry and really became a lot more mature in a very, very short period of time.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. Now, let's kind of wrap it up because we have plenty more other things we want to cover of your career here. Obviously, I'm sure plenty of other great stories there. But before we move on from there, what's your take on, obviously ESPN now at the final stage, which had bought over the whole block again, and it was no longer that joint venture. After a few years, them taking it over finally, and this is Disney now, of course, shutting the whole thing down. And this is really it's somewhat just, I think, before COVID or around that time here. So it is very recent still. What's your reading? What you from a distance would look at it and saying, since you were part of launching it, what didn't happen or what changed? Maybe, either one of those.
Look, I think every business has to operate in its own manner, and obviously where their priorities are, where they're spending their money, and where they're getting the most bang for their buck. I always like to say that when someone buys a set of rights, beauty is always in the eye of the beholder, and which is to say that on a P&L basis, it may not make sense, but strategically it may make sense, and that was exactly the case when we bought the BCCI rights. I mean, obviously there was just an L because we had no revenue,
right?
And we did our best to try to handicap it, but it was clearly the catalyst that got us on the ground there. So I would just say that I think every business has to look at markets where they think there's the greatest amount of upside and where they are putting their capital, and certainly India is an important market for them, given what they're looking at now, especially with what their streaming goals are to get to 260 million subs. Obviously they have here in the next week or so a decision to make on this IPL deal, which is not going to be inexpensive, to say the least. So, look, all I can say is that it was, every company goes through different phases of their business, and this is a decision they made, and they're also not going to be in a situation from a television perspective where they're going to be making a lot of money on a subscription basis out of China. That still has not changed. Yep. So they're putting their energies where they think they're going to get their best return. And
sure. And like I said, it obviously left a huge hole in the sports, I guess, spectrum here in Asia, especially Southeast Asia. It's slowly being filled by a few new players who taken over some of the rights and doing a good job now, getting back in there. Of course, the local players now, the local broadcast, pay TV operators have kind of taken up some of the slack and just creating their own channels, etc. So, as usual, sports will come out of it, and I haven't seen so much new numbers and why I'm assuming everyone took some hits, some here and there. But yeah, life goes on. But it was a huge shock, of course. But as I said, but let's come back to your part of the story here. So now you've been in the world of sports for several years here. Helped set up ESPN Star at the end, and all of a sudden you in CNBC Asia, which is the big giant, of course, but it's a completely different industry. It's, business news, etc. How did you make that shift? Or where did that come from? Where is what sort of what triggered that?
I had said to ESPN that I was ready to come home after 10 years, and so George Bodenheimer offered me a job back in New York, and it was working for somebody that I wasn't particularly fond of, and I decided not to stay and decided to go and do my own thing. And so I then became CEO of a sports technology company out of Auckland, New Zealand called Virtual Spectator, which is early stage. And unfortunately, it crashed and burned. And then CNBC asked me to go back to Asia to run that business. And I looked at that. I obviously had my experience at Drexel, and it was GE. Again, it was another joint venture between GE and Dow Jones. And so I figured, well, this is a good opportunity to do something a little different, here again to see if this is something that I might like doing. So anyway, I went out there. I really enjoyed it for a lot of reasons. There were some other reasons that I didn't enjoy it, but I enjoyed it because the reasons I did enjoy it were around the fact that GE, I learned so much being part of that culture, and Jack Welch at the time was chairman, and I drank the Kool-Aid, and I think a lot of the people have their own views about GE and NBC and everything else. But I think when you run a business, there are a lot of principles that come out of that culture that I think make a lot of sense, and I strive to.
Yeah, I read his book, and absolutely, there's some good stuff in there.
I think one thing I will say is, look, business news is not sports. It's a lot more difficult to run that business when you're not part of a bundle. Business news can't stand on its own like sports can. One of the things that we did do, created a joint venture with Shanghai Media Group with Li Ruigong, which is the first one in China. We also brought in Alibaba as a big sponsor of our Asian Business Leader Award. So I spent a lot of time with Jack Ma, getting a chance to see what Alibaba was on the ground floor. But anyway, I was out there for 5 years with them, and then it really was time to come home after 15 years. And I came back.
15 years in the wilderness.
Yeah, it was. But, it's, God, the relationships that I developed, the people that I worked with. And look, at the end of the day, Marcus, that's the bottom line is it's the people you work with. I mean, that, you asked me, okay, what are some of the highs you've had in your career? It's really the people. I have been so fortunate to work with great people, and that's really what gets me out of bed every day. And that's been a lot of fun. And the Barry Ronos of the world, and the Chris McDonalds, and the Rick Dovies, and the Simon Hughes, and so forth. While I was in Asia, Dave Zucker and Bruce Churchill, Stern, obviously, and Bornstein. I mean, just a great group. And the other thing I would say, just from an ESPN perspective, we talk about financial rigor and discipline. I mean, Chris Dreesen, who's the CFO of ESPN, she was just awesome. And David Paul, who's our attorney, who's in general counsel at ESPN, who actually hired at MLL to do some work for us. I mean, as a young person because you're out there and you're in your late 20s and your early 30s, and you're still trying to figure all of this stuff out. I'm still trying to figure it out. But to be able to have that level of support and to be able to have people like that to work with you and to really give you guidance and so forth is, it means everything. And I think that had a lot to do with us being as effective as we were.
Well, no doubt. Now I want to jump a little bit here, also watch your time here, and jump straight into Univision. I know there's a couple of stops in there in between, but I think it's a good segment. ESPN, Star Sports, CNBC, and here comes Univision again, big player, but completely different part of the world. I believe you were president of sports there. So again, let's talk a bit about it and your experience there, being now involved with, I guess, the largest Hispanic-focused platform in the U.S. at that time, right? I'm assuming maybe they still are, but at least so what do I remember from them. So talk about that a bit.
Well, I mean, I was recruited they wanted to launch a domestic cable dedicated sports channel, and so I was recruited to basically build that, create it, which I did. And I called at that time Joe Yuba was the CEO, and sadly he was only there for 3 months. He left after, I guess, in March. I came in December, and then Randy Falco ended up taking over. But I called Jeff Mason, who was one of my close friends, and helped me. He was at ESPN with me, and I basically said, "Okay, here's my charge. I need help with someone to help me build a broadcast facility. We're going to create our own version of Sports Center. We need set designers and all this." So Mason basically said, "You need to call A, B, C, D, and F," and he was just spot on. And then I hired David Neal to be my executive producer, who was the executive producer at NBC Sports. And then I also hired Eric Conrad, who just left Univision, to basically manage all of our programming. So we got it up in record time. Obviously, it's a very interesting dynamic. It was an interesting dynamic in Univision at that point. You had 4 private equity firms plus Televisa as shareholders, and you're also in a situation where they had done a leveraged buyout at a very big number, and they're trying to figure out how they can get back to that number so they can sell it. But in any event, it was a lot of fun. Very unique culture, to say the least. But we got it done, and Televisa basically they're the 900-pound gorilla, and decided they wanted to have their own one of their own people sort of run sports, and that, I guess, happened sort of 1.5 years, almost 2 years after I got there.
And now again, what this, when we talk about the Hispanic market, clearly, I mean, it's obvious, what sort of content, I guess, would be focused, to some degree, I guess, football, soccer, from other parts of the world or from other Latin American countries, maybe boxing, etc. Is that sort of what you go going after, or what was the remit?
The Liga Mexicana was obviously a critical catalyst in all of that. We also had our deal with the MLS, which I'll talk about in a second. We had the last World Cup. We had all the World Cups.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
We had CONCACAF. We didn't have Common Bowl because our competitor in that space is obviously Telemundo, which is part of NBC. But one of the things about having David in there was, okay, how do we try to there's no more discerning consumer of football than the Hispanic consumer. And so how do we create something that's more akin to the U.S. market? And this is one of the issues that coverage at Univision had always been, well, this is how people watch these games and watch all the stuff in Mexico. And that was where we're trying to turn the tide to basically try to incorporate more production value that you would see on an NFL broadcast. So one day I went over to see Garber, went over there, David, Neal, and I went over, and we basically said, look, what we want to do is we want to bring the action off the pitch into the living room. And we wanted to have cameras in different places and mics and all this stuff. And we thought we might be able to get that done with the MLS. Unfortunately, FIFA has got fairly arcane rules about all of that stuff, and we're trying to get a World Cup here, so they weren't as amenable to making a lot of those changes. I think they have incorporated a bunch more of them now. But at the end of the day, it's trying to give the viewer the best experience possible and through the use of audio. And one of the benefits I had at ESS was that I had David Hill. So I had Mason and David Hill, who were longtime friends and absolutely two of the best people in the history of production in the world of sports television as my guide. And that's one of Hilly's great attributes is his use of audio. And I think that's, even today, this is what viewers want. They want to hear what the players are saying. They want to hear what the referees are saying. Right. And this is one of the dynamics you have to deal with in the international world of sports, is that different federations have different ways of dealing with things where less is more. And so FIFA and F1 for a long time were in the same boat and really trying to put fence around a lot of that. So anyway, try as we might have, but I'm happy to say I think a lot of that's changed at this point.
Right. All right, let's talk one world sport, because it kind of brings a little bit back to Asia. If I understood it correctly, you shared with me that Seamus O'Brien was one of the founders or a main man maybe behind the venture, who was, interesting enough, the gentleman who brought me to Asia in 1994. Seamus is the guy who hired me when I first came here and worked with him for several years before I went on my own. So Seamus is definitely one of the more colorful characters, of course, in our industry here, especially if anyone who's done business here in Asia would obviously know of him. But now he is venturing into the U.S., and there's one world sport. So obviously you guys, I'm sure, must have known each other still from your ESPN or ESS days. How do you end up in that new outfit, and talk about it?
So, yeah, I knew Seamus from ProServ, quite honestly.
Oh, right. Okay. That long back. Right.
Yeah. And he was at CSI, which was ProServ.
Correct. He was CSI. Correct.
We were doing the same thing. But anyway, so he wanted to launch a channel targeted to Asians in the U.S. and asked me if what my thoughts were and if I'd be interested in doing it. And I said, well, you need a lot of live content, because that's the only thing that's going to resonate with the MVPDs in this market.
Is that live content is what you said, is it?
Live content.
Right.
And so not necessarily content out of Asia.
Right.
So anyway, this is sort of a similar situation to, it was produced and not very well out of Singapore and then sent back to the U.S. Through IP delivery through one of the companies. There are sort of 5 companies in this group. And so I went and I hired Joel Feld, who was a longtime guy at ABC Sports, and it was the head programming guy in Essen, to help me put all this stuff together. And then I hired Randy Brown, who was at ESPN with me, to run all my distribution. And I will tell you that Randy is, there's nobody better in the distribution space in the U.S. than Randy Brown. He was unbelievable. So they were, I think, they had 2 deals and distribution deals in the U.S. And by the time we ended up selling it, we had close to 70.
Right.
And
these are affiliate deals, right? Is what you're talking about here.
Affiliate deals.
Yeah.
And so we brought all of the production to the U.S. and we went to Encompass in Stanford, and we basically produced everything out of Stanford. And we didn't do anything in the studio. We did everything pretty much off tube. We also brought in commentary from other locations. So, for example, we bought the ECB rights, and we used all of Sky's production, which is tremendous. We had things like the CBA, the Chinese Basketball Association, the Chinese Super League. We had the KHL out of Russia. And we did all that. We did, things like that we would do in Stanford, but again, off tube with not a studio presence. Right. The NASL. And then we also brought in the club channels. We did a deal with IMG to bring in the club channels to Chelsea, Arsenal, Bayern Munich, AC Milan, which were basically, they were 1-day delay or 6-hour delay in some cases of that content, but it was good brand name content. Right. And the amount of live content that we had at One World was really, again, the catalyst that got us as many distribution deals as we did. And it was well produced, and the brand was great. Our interstitials were great. Joel did a great job putting the whole thing together, and
in terms of the demographics, you obviously you said the Asian community in Asia, in the U.S. That could either be people there, live there, grown there, grew up there, or moved there. But let's define that a bit more. Is it the Indian market would be fairly obvious that you need cricket for them, but someone out of China doesn't care about cricket, neither does a Japanese or someone from Southeast Asia. So how do you define that further down to really target that audience? How do you guys do that?
Well, every cable operator is looking. I mean, obviously they have a need to be able to serve that audience, and when you have as much live content as we had, I mean, look, I looked at it not as a channel targeted to Asians, to the Asian diaspora, if I can, which I use that term loosely. Obviously, it's an international sports channel.
Right.
There are normal things that you can't see. So the World Table Tennis Championships, some of the other things that I referenced,
et cetera. Right. Okay.
India coming in and playing, with very, very strong production value, and so what was happening, the dynamic that we had, Marcus, was that ESPN at the time, a lot of these entities would go to ESPN, and ESPN said, well, we'll get you on SportsCenter. And then they would cut a deal with them, and they put it on the shelf, and never to see the light of day again. Mm-hmm. And we basically said, look, we're going to make you our Super Bowl. And we did. We promoted it. We put the production value in. We created the interstitials. And that's how we got a lot of that content. Now, this was before the streaming had started. Right. And then we also had there was also a shift from the MVPDs to bundling. So, for example, they'll go and cut a deal with the Walt Disney Company and take 15 channels, or they'll take 11 channels from Discovery. So standalone channels are a very tough putt on MVPDs at this point. Mm-hmm. But because we're sports and we're live, and we were able to get carriage and also get paid. And unfortunately, we just, the market moved for us, and we weren't able to get as many deals that were required, predicated upon what the investment that was being made by our shareholders. Mm. And, basically our shareholders decided that they needed to sell the business, and that's what we did. And it was a very tough one for me, because I think out of all the things that I've done, I mean, ESPN and ESS was obviously heads and tails above everything else, but this was right behind it, because we had such great people. It was like the phoenix rising from the ashes. We had great content. It looked great. We had great reception from the cable operators. We were priced right, and it is what it is. Mm.
Yeah, I remember. I think we had a couple of deals with you guys as well. I can't remember actually what content, but it might have been one of those sort of either table tennis or badminton, which we represented at the time. Now, So did the business ever make money, or was it
No,
was on its way there? Or?
No, we had made, a bunch of changes on the expense side to get us to, closer to profitability, but we were not making money. And look, at the end of the day, we needed more deals and we needed more time, and we just didn't have it. And
so 11 is the one who bought it, right? So Andrea,
yeah.
That's correct, right? When was that? When did that happen, or how recent is that we're talking about here?
That happened in 2017.
Right. Okay. So pretty much when you left, then, right? Okay, got it.
We sold it, and I wound it up, and
okay.
And then
I was just gonna say, so the brand doesn't exist anymore, the platform.
They incorporated into 11, and okay. I candidly, I don't think 11's here any longer. They're trying to figure. Unfortunately, we had a bake off, and I think
it didn't go down as well as you'd like it. Yeah, I think you mentioned something like that last time.
In the hands of the other bidder, I think it would still be around, but it is what it is. I mean, it's just unfortunately that's the way these things.
Life goes on. And that, in your case, was Major League Lacrosse. Now, you had mentioned very early in the conversation that you played lacrosse, right? I think it was university or... and now you're coming here and you becoming the commissioner of Major League Lacrosse, which is obviously what you've now done here for the last several years. Let's talk a bit about that before we, of course, get into what you're going to be doing here going forward here. So clearly you obviously have a passion for the sport, and now you're on the sporting side of it rather than on the broadcaster or the other side of the business here. So talk a bit about it.
Well, I played Division I in college, and I played in the predecessor league of MLL, and it's always been a passion for me. And I was recruited to do it. It was a turnaround. I went to Stern and talked to him a lot about this before, and he told me I had 3 heads for doing it. I mean, we had a situation where we had 11 teams. We had one owner had 6.5 of the 11 votes. We didn't have our media rights. We had something in this thing where we had this called founding member, where the 4 founding members of the league had a call option on the next 75% of our next 5 franchise fees. So someone said, why are you doing this?
Right. So not well structured, basically, is what you're saying.
I laid all this stuff out for Stern, and that's why he gave me the reaction he did. But look, the league had been around for 20 years. I can't tell you that it was managed in the right fashion from previous management. So it was very much of a turnaround, and we did that, actually. We put a 3-year plan in, I guess, after the first. We put that in probably 3 months after I got there, which, interestingly enough, is the basis for a lot of what's happened now with PLL. And so I was able to get it down to 1 owner, 1 vote. I got all of our media rights back and immediately cut a deal with ESPN and got rid of this founding member thing. All the while, year into this thing, we have a competitor league that shows up, which one of our players was at the center of. And so we had to manage that. And, I had, unfortunately, a lot of owners that just had been there way too long. And so... one thing led to another. We also had to deal with the COVID situation like everybody else.
Oh, sure,
we also had the benefit of sports gambling, which started to show up. So we started to get involved in that, and we had some really good traction with MGM to actually, we had a sort of an agreement in principle to do our All-Star game on the Strip, which ESPN was going to televise, and MGM was going to front it, and it just would have been a great thing for the sport all the way around. But it is here again. For me, it was another experience. It was, as I said to Stern, I said, now I know why you get paid the big bucks, having to deal with all the different things we had to deal with. And I mean, COVID didn't help. Having a competitor league didn't help. There are, a number of things that transpired. But I'm happy to say that we did turn it around. We did get a great television deal, and we ended up merging it with PLL, which has been backed by Joe Tsai in particular. And we'll see what happens in that basis.
Right. Okay. So that is sort of where U.S. sort of handing it over now, right? As the two emerging.
We did that. We closed the deal a year ago, and then I wound the entity up and just left. And I let everybody go a year ago, and then I just had to. There's a lot of things that had to get done to wind it up, which I did. And I was in Boston for 5 years, for those 5 years, and then at the beginning of April, I effectively launched my own sort of hung out my own shingle, my own sort of sports consultancy to really focus on sports and media.
Yeah, let's talk about that a bit. It's called Poshundo, or how do I pronounce it properly?
That was Poshen Road was where I lived in Hong Kong.
Oh, right.
So
okay.
Do is in Cantonese was road, so Poshendo. So I mean, it was just something I came up with as more of a placeholder, and it's really more just I have a client in India and I have a client in Israel right now, and obviously looking to add to the roster, but just trying to help open doors here in this country and also in other places if I can.
Well, obviously we just went through it over the last hour plus here, with your huge experience in media and a little bit sprinkled over a few other things. So obviously that's, I'm sure, what your focus is back in it. But at the same time, we obviously, the world has changed dramatically, right? We don't have as much of the, let's call it, traditional pay TV. There is there's the OTT models. There is all sort of other models are constantly coming and going. And last time we had an interesting conversation about how ARPU versus subscriber grows, and why how did Netflix valuation just drop so much, and maybe where certain analysts and others getting things wrong. Yeah, and I think you had some really interesting thoughts there. Just talk a bit about that. What you feel. Looking at that world the way it is now, that some people may be looking at it from the wrong lens.
Well, I mean, look, when you get right down to it, I mean, ultimately, it's what revenue are you going to drive, and what's the quality of that. One question that always comes out is, what's the quality of those subscribers? And in this case, what's the revenue that you have associated against these subscribers, and then what is your cost to be able to acquire them? I think that's one of the real questions that Wall Street's asking right now of Disney in terms of this IPL deal. Are they going to, the last deal went for $2.7 billion, and it'll probably go for 6.5 plus.
Wow, that's the number you hear, and that's 10 years. Then is it? That's still 5 year deal. 5 year. Wow, 6 million plus for 5 years. Oh, nice.
And so, what is that cost going to be to acquire those subscribers, and then what are you getting back in terms of revenue? So,
just for the non-cricket fans, IPL stands for the Indian Premier League, and that is the Indian Cricket League. So those are some significant numbers there. Wow.
I mean, Moffat Nathan came out with something basically saying that if Disney were to pay that kind of money, it's about $120 for every Disney Plus subscriber, and it's going to take them 13 years to get that money back. But ultimately, as I keep coming back to it, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. And when we bought the rights to the BCCI to basically launch the business in India, and by the way, when we made our acquisition decisions at ESS, everything was done on a P&L basis. So we didn't even look at the subscription element. We just looked at the advertising. And if we can break even on advertising, then everything else is gravy. But now when you buy rights, and this has been going on for years, obviously you've got to come up with certain assumptions in terms of what the subscription contribution is going to be and so forth. And I mean, ultimately that's a decision that anybody's got to make when they buy content. But and in the case of these streaming services, I mean, it's just crazy when you think about the fact that the Walt Disney Company is going to spend over $30 billion in content to service all of its video business, including streaming. I mean, that's just a huge number. But then again, you think about the NFL rights that they just took with the renewal of those deals, I guess they went from $5 billion plus a year to over $10 billion plus a year, and that doesn't even include Sunday Ticket.
Yep.
So That's why it's really important to make sure that when you think about these other markets and you're growing the subscriber base, obviously you've got to think about, okay, well, what's the number? What's the, what's the revenue? What's your ARPU going to be in each one of these situations?
What you called ARPU blend, right? Which is what you were talking about earlier. How
Just
you
example, you go back to ESPN, where you got a dollar out of Southeast Asia, you got a penny out of China, and you got 5 cents out of India. If you look at that region, you just blend all that together, and that's where you really have to. You've got to look at it and say, okay, well, what's the quality of those subscribers in terms of top line, in terms of revenue?
And that's what I think. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I think Netflix has a flat price policy globally. I think it's the same amount anywhere in the world, as far as I've at least seen. I may be wrong now, but and that it always, to me, it always puzzles me a little bit why they wouldn't change that in countries where there is a population who might not be able to easily afford that, as you may be able to charge in the U.S. So, again, seems to be a bit of an odd one, unless they've changed that already. But that's the last time I looked at it, at least.
Well, if you're a public market company, then you've obviously got to play a bit of a different game, and obviously you've got to look at valuation and where you're spending that money, where you're spending, what are your content costs, and where you're spending them, and all that kind of thing. And ultimately, you're going to have to play to Wall Street to a fair degree. But I mean, look, as these streaming services are continuing to gain traction, certainly here in this country, you've seen cord cutting. So in the U.S., I think from a sports and news perspective, the estimate's probably 58 million is in terms of the floor. The number of homes for ESPN, for example, has come down from sort of in the high 90 millions in the last 5 years down to, I think they're probably 78 million.
Right.
And that's just the way it is. And what's happening is that the entertainment consumers are leaving the cable bundle, and then the cable bundle's left to its core sports consumers, and that's probably where your floor is going to be, somewhere in sort of close to 60 million.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, maybe just a sort of last couple of thoughts here as we wrap it up. You got the zone out there again, having dipped their toes into all sort of things in the U.S. with boxing, and somewhat around the world with boxing. And then you have, of course, they launched a couple of platforms. Japan is sort of, they restructured their deal there from what you read. You got 11 with a again, slightly different business model there is out. I mean, everyone sees it, and for the very, very, a couple of years ago, we all called it, the Netflix of sports, which, no one has really pulled off in that sense, or maybe ever will. But what do you see? I mean, where do you see is that going? And, ESPN Plus and others, as you said, now throwing a lot of money at things and moving their or what is it where, from your 20, 30 years here in this industry now, where do you see who's going to come out of the winner, which is probably hard to predict anyway right now?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can't make that prediction of who's going to win here. I mean, I think that clearly content is critically important. You got to have the right content in each one of these markets. And I can just go back to another example of years ago when ESPN owned a third of Eurosport. They didn't make the decision to go and acquire Serie A in Italy or Bundesliga in Germany, because at the end of the day they didn't have the money to do it. It was prohibitive. But driver content is always going to be paramount in every one of these markets, and whether it's boxing or whether you're going into Japan, you're buying the baseball or wherever it is.
Cricket in India.
Cricket in India. And in the case of the U.S., the NFL, which certainly Amazon has looked at that as putting it on basically is giving it a leg into the subscription business. And this is what the NFL drove Fox, and it had a big, it was a very big catalyst for ESPN. Right. So every market has these things. And this is where someone's got to make a decision about what it is they're going to spend and where they're going to spend their money. And then obviously, if they can, now that you're in a situation where impressions get aggregated in so many different ways, can you make it work from an advertising perspective? So ultimately, you've got a business. And those are all key considerations when one considers launching services in any particular market. The good news is there are a lot more ways where you can make money, whether it's programmatic advertising. Now you have the whole gambling piece of this. That's a whole nother set of dynamics. But it's all about aggregating impressions from that perspective. And then obviously being able to have content that people are going to be willing to pay for.
Absolutely. I think I like that. It's a good way to finish off that it's really about the content is the key part, but then at the end of the day, it is how you monetize it, right? And as you rightly just said, there is so many new ways of monetizing it. The live is always still going to be a big important part, but of course there's clips, there's other, short form, there's NFTs, there's the gambling part of it, there's other gamification parts to it. So I think that's where we all see, of course, and I'm sure you and I read the same stuff every day, where we see the industry's heading, and I'm sure we'll have some more conversation about it. But Sanya, this was fun. It was a good hour and a half here of this amazing careers of yours across the world, now back in the US. So I'm sure we'll hear more from you, and I'm sure others who will listen to this, if they need some help with some of these new ideas and channels around the world, they know you're the guy to call.
Well, it's been a lot of fun, and I appreciate the opportunity to chat, Marcus. I mean, it's as I said at the outset, it's all about the people. And you were in that fabric. Obviously, it's a great business, and it's fun to see the ebbs and the flows over the years, and obviously, long after we're gone, it will continue to do the same thing. So, but it has been a lot of fun. I will say that.
Absolutely, we'll continue to have fun with it. So, Thandi, have a good day there in Baltimore. Your day is just starting. Mine is winding down here. So, and we'll talk again soon.
Great. Thanks, Marcus. Really appreciate it.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
The Sports Entrepreneurs by Marcus Luer podcasts are a collection of interviews and stories. All content in this podcast is the copyright of Marcus Luer. Reproduction and distribution of the presentation without written permission of the owner is prohibited. All rights reserved.